that? What is being told to emergency personnel? Like, what are there expectations that are brought upon, or this is how you handle a situation? What's the training like? I guess if you could take us, I know it's a broad question, but if you could just kind of give us some insight as to what happens as they're preparing to respond to an event like this.
Great question, because what you are really referring to are the phases of disasters, right? That are very often not visible to, to the cameras or to the public in general, which is the phases before an incident occurs, right? Which is generally mitigation and preparedness, which involves a lot of planning that, predates impact, right, when an event happens. And this is a role that is played not just by emergency managers, whose job it is really to coordinate and try and facilitate preparedness, right, for these events, but it also includes other sectors coming into the pictures. If depending on what the jurisdiction is and what the hazards are, you might have public health playing a role. You might have, the Department of Transportation. So there's all these emergency support functions that are critical, that are people prepare for, that people are credentialed for, and that they actually have exercises practicing for events, right, that could occur in a jurisdiction. So there's a lot of work and heavy lifting that goes on prior to the actual response, which, like I said, is the most visible time, because it's in front of the cameras and people are aware of it. And in the case of Texas, just such a catastrophic occurrence, we are seeing what has been years and years of practice and science and resourcing that is now being playing out actually.
Is it a broad set of guidance and skills that apply to any situation, or does it depend on the type of event, whether that's a weather rain event or tornado? You know what I mean? Or how do you
Yes,
adjudicate that?
yes, yeah. And so what I like about your question is because you really do touch on what the realities of disaster response are, which is there are a set of practices, right, that are very similar regardless what the event is. But depending on what the critical issue is, or what the hazard is, or what has caused the disaster, right, then you bring in the people with that specialty. But for the most part, there's a practice that's referred to as an all hazards approach, where you know that there are key functions that are going to be necessary at any event. So now that there's a flooding component here in Texas, then what you do is now, maybe diminish the role of some of the other functions and kind of amplify some of the functions that are related to flooding, such as search and rescue, which might not be the case if there was another kind of incident that did not require the level of search and rescue, or the very specific water search and rescue that we are seeing in this case. The thing to understand here is that the amount of resource and training that goes on prior to this event is quite broad and also very, very highly specialized.
Yeah, a lot of course, horrible the lives lost,
Yeah,
when it comes to
yeah.
this, but also that training saves lives too, right? Like you do, I think maybe that people underestimate that it does prevent further tragedy, yeah, I should
It
say.
does.
Yeah.
It does. It does. It does. The work of emergency management is to really try as much as possible, working with different partners to minimize the impact of hazards, right? And eliminate those that you can. But we also know that there are those that you cannot totally eliminate. And so what you do is you prepare for that. And when those happen, what you try and do by applying your resources, your skills, the data, the technology, what you do with that is to try as much as possible to save lives. Okay. And oftentimes we never really get to hear a lot of stories told about the near misses, the events that didn't happen or the lives that were saved. We might get anecdotal data on that, but it still is very tragic whenever any life is lost. And of course, with Texas, the numbers getting to 90, this is really catastrophic, a very, very sad affair. But you're right about the fact that, there is a lot of training that goes into it and preparation. But remember, this is a very skilled kind of response.
Is there, I'm curious from watching the coverage, and seeing that there's also volunteers that come into play. You know what I mean? I guess how does that dynamic work? Because obviously you have all this training, but then you have people that want to help. How do you work with how do you work with your students, whoever, or how does that work when it comes to bringing others into the fold and making sure that they're not only helping but also being safe and not putting themselves in harm's way?
I like that setting because what you do right there is you touch on my students, right? But you also touch on the fact that the actual real responders to an event are the people who are most proximate, right, to what happens. They are the actual first responders, but they might not be the technical ones, but they are the ones who rush there first because people are altruistic and they're also involved in saving their neighbors and their friends, right? So what you see in the field of, in the realm of disaster response with regards to volunteers is that there are different kinds of categories. First of all, the work of emergency management or the work of disasters cannot be done without volunteers. And so, because of that, there's a lot of trained people who work as volunteers and provide excellent, trained, credentialed work during events, and they work alongside professionals. And they too know exactly what their roles in, and they come and lock in with the emergency managers and other responding agencies to support the collective effort. So, for example, there's a national volunteer organization for organizations active in disasters. That's actually an umbrella body that, kind of provides the leadership and the guidance that is necessary and helps also in the appointment of, who needs to go where at what time. So volunteers are critical. You also have another level of volunteers who self deploy. Okay, like I said, the initial ones. But then, if a disaster continues to compound, then it is necessary sometimes to have those immediately deploying people to also step back if they are able to assess that what they're about to do is dangerous, right? And so that you're not now starting to commit resources to either try and go rescue them as well. So, and that's the case here in Texas. People are certainly self-deploying, but because of what the weather looks like, the weather forecast right now is there has been a request for them to hold off of that. And the value of volunteers is so important that what you have emergency management doing now is that they generate numbers or stations where people who are self-deploying can actually go to or call and get in real time training before they go out, to do specific things and also get some credentialing so that they're not out risking their lives and those of the people that they are trying to help as well.
When people are watching this coverage and seeing some of these stories, whether that's a good story or an unfortunate story at that, what should people know about the emergency management and these responders? What's something that might either is a misconception or something that people don't fully understand about the work they do?
The thing to understand is that these are people who are committed and dedicated to saving lives way before impact happens. That is their job 24/7. They are involved in networking in communities. They are involved in trying to bring different organizations together. They are involved in trying to get grants and funding so that they can, participate in preparing themselves for those eventualities that, they cannot avoid. These are people who during disasters are doing the work of coordinating for the most part. It's a managerial role. You might not necessarily see them out in the field depending on what's going on, but they are involved in trying to bring in the resources that are necessary to respond to what is going on. These are people who also live in the communities, right? They are local, and all disasters really are local at the end of the day, and all response starts local. Okay, so being able to know your emergency managers, following them on social media, right? The social media accounts that they have, tuning into the radio if you listen to the radio or to TV, and following what it is that they are asking us to do, right? And yes, we might triangulate the data that they are giving it, but to understand that these are the most proximate to events and to the communities. So being able to understand that that's the job that they do, and it's an evolving job, because threats can be different depending on what season it is or what emerging issue is that exists.
When does the I guess it might not ever end, but when in terms of an event, when do they feel like how long is this? We just talked about before, during, and then even after some of the, as a search and
Mm,
rescue, how
mhm.
long, does the work continue in a place? You know what I mean? At the end of the day, what in
Yeah,
terms of their presence there and their involvement in an area.
yeah, yeah. So the locals remain local,
Hmm. Right. Yeah.
right? The community never forgets.
Yeah.
Recovery is ongoing
Hmm.
because even if the structures have been restored and hopefully in a more robust manner, the event remains in the people's collective psyche, right? And they reference it. Whether they reference it as, as a point where a shift happened in policy or practice, or whether they reference it in the unfortunate case for now, like with Texas, where lives were lost, lives were hurt, people were shifted, it remains in the collective psyche, right? So the work of recovery is one that is very often underestimated, but it is ongoing, right? And what's happening now because of the increase in the number of disasters that we are seeing and the magnitude is that this recovery phase continues to be more compressed because you have a compounding effect of the events, and it's the seasonal events as well as the emergent events that perhaps were not very familiar to the people that live in a place, right? So when you think about it, for example, these floods that are happening currently are happening after prior events that have occurred, including the pandemic, right? A pandemic is something we have not lived through in over 100 years, because the 2009 one was not very as significant as the one that we recently had in 2020. So understanding that we live in a space and place where disasters are part of society, right? We need to have that stance of preparedness and mitigation, understanding that investing in mitigation has implications for response and for recovery.
That bring it back now to your role in all of this and your instruction. How do you, I guess, what's your purpose here and what you want your students to know and your classes and how you work with them at the end of the day, when it comes to being a person that also tries to impart some of this on them.
I do. Um, One of the reasons why I actually get a lot of satisfaction in the work that I do is because I see the proverbial bulbs coming on for some of my students who, when we analyze an issue, right, they bring in their own lived experiences, which we juxtapose with the lived experiences of other students.
Hmm.
Then we compare that with what the disaster science is, what the research indicates. We look at policy, we look at practice, and the students come out of it, and even I myself come out of it having learned a different way of making an assessment. Okay? And when you can make an assessment that you can then take and with some innovation adjust and conform to fit your community, and your community starts with your family. So when you make decisions for your family, then you make decisions for your community, you make decisions for the place where you work, right, that can bring about the changes that we need to see happening in daily living. That is where the change happens. That's what I work very hard, right, to learn and also to teach to my students. So I'll give you an example with what's happening in Texas. Disaster science is very clear about vulnerability to disasters. Okay, and what you see is that in this very unfortunate scenario, we have lost a lot of lives of people who were not necessarily locals to the place. Okay, And one of the lessons that we teach in my field in emergency management and disaster science is that whenever you are a tourist, whenever you're going to a location that you have never gone before, it's important for you to understand the disaster profile of a place. We saw it also for example, in Indonesia, right? Whenever we had the flooding. So whenever you're going somewhere where you are not very familiar with, it's not your typical place, it's important to understand what likely happens during this season in this area. My cell phone service, how good is it? Is it robust? How can I communicate or how can I receive communication? Do I need to start following the local emergency managers or the national weather or the different people that provide information? Should I add them to my notification? Am I, tuned into that? So that gives you a slice, a very thin slice of some of what we teach, where we bring along the science, the practice, and lived experiences to hopefully inform and shift communication and understanding around the field.
Real quick, you mentioned the lived experiences aspect, and it kind of touches on the greater whole of what we've been talking about. It feels like also there is, I don't know if it's something you can teach, but also there's the empathy, I could say, and
Mhm.
also there's an emotional like aspect. You mentioned the impact on a psyche of a region or
Yes, yes,
people. There's
yes,
also probably something that of emergency management and someone that's doing this has to have a people skill, right? You have to be able to talk to people that are experiencing the worst day of their lives, or
absolutely.
right? There's probably an aspect
Mhm,
of that where you
mhm,
probably try to teach that, or at
mhm,
least help them understand this
mhm.
is the empathy that you need to walk into a room or walk
Yeah,
into a
yes,
backyard and say, here,
yes,
here I am for
yes.
you, right?
Mhm, mhm. Spot on.
Yeah, like that's an important
This
aspect of this.
Oh, it's a critical aspect. And majority people doing this work are like your are like your doctors. They're like your fire responders. They're like your, police. They are doing it because they have this understanding and care and want to bring about change, and some protection around that. So they are seeking the information, they are seeking the technology, the data that they need to bring this change. What you're touching on is having a mental capacity and a mental intelligence as well to be able to help people on their worst day as an emergency manager, while also understanding that because you come from that local community, you're most probably going to be helping people that you grew up with, people that you care about, your own family members, right? And having the fortitude that you need to actually still, perform as you need to. And understanding the mental health component of disaster management, both as an individual who works in the field, right? And as someone who needs to understand the mental health needs of your constituents or the people that you're working is also very critical. So you also touch on a field that looks at disaster mental health, right? So which is very critical for the work that we do.
What does the field need? Are there challenges right now that need to be overcome? Are there support systems, whether that's from the public, officials? What does the field need right now?
The field needs a lot of education, learning from elementary level. That's a great place to start. We have disjointed disasters, yet we live with them every day. So, just like financial literacy is critical, or public health literacy is critical for how we live, disaster literacy too is a thing. It is part of our day to day because if we are not responding to a disaster, we are recovering from one or preparing for one or should be mitigating for against one, right? So education, learning is central. Okay. And then using data to make sound decisions is critical rather than making decisions out of whatever in other influences that might not necessarily be helpful to you as an individual or as a community. There's a need for research in my field, research funding. There's a need for more practitioners, right? There's a need for more diverse practitioners in the field. And there's also a need for partnership, cohesive partnership, not just with my students who are graduating or the emergency managers that are already out there, but also with the public sector, with faith organizations, with people who are working in private institutions, non-profits that do a tremendous job as well, right? So that cohesive partnership is also very critical because we cannot disassociate ourselves from events and think they are too far removed from us. They are not. They really aren't, right? They really have impact for us, even if we are not as proximate to them.
Dr. Mwarumba, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.